In this video, we're looking at the most dangerous teens ever sentenced to life in prison and their chilling reactions when they realized they'd likely never walk free again. Some dangerous teen unalivers were as young as 13 at the time. Here's how the most dangerous teens reacted to their life sentences. Lionel Tate. Lionel Tate became the youngest American ever to receive a life sentence. He was only 12 at the time when he unalived 6-year-old Tiffany Junick. Lionel's mother had been tasked with babysitting her niece, Tiffany, that evening. She left the two kids downstairs to play and watch television while she worked upstairs. A few minutes later, Lionel came rushing upstairs, claiming that Tiffany was not breathing. Emergency dispatchers were immediately called, and they were shocked at Tiffany's condition. She had suffered multiple wounds, and experts claimed that it almost seemed like she had been rammed by a car repeatedly. Lionel later confessed that the two were play wrestling while watching WrestleMania on television, and he was just practicing moves on her. Defense argued that he had no intention on unaliving his cousin, but prosecution claimed that Lionel showcased a sort of violence that was typically seen in adult, repeat offenders. The judge was shocked at the prosecution's evidence against Lionel and recommended the maximum sentence, a lifetime in lockup. However, the prosecution then joined the defense in trying to overturn Lionel's lifetime conviction. This was a controversial move, and the judge claimed that the prosecution should not have charged him with unaliving in the first place. In any case, Lionel was released in 2004 for a year's house arrest. Unfortunately, this was not the last time he would be locked up. In 2005, while still a teen, Lionel was arrested yet again for violating his probation. He had reportedly threatened a pizza delivery driver with a weapon. Lionel was rearrested and this time sentenced to 40 years in prison. Paul Gingerich. Paul Gingerich was just 12 years old when he became involved in one of the most shocking juvenile cases in Indiana's history. In April 2010, he and a 15-year-old friend, Colt Lundy, plotted to unalive Colt's stepfather, Philip Danner, in the quiet town of Cromwell. The plan was driven by Colt's desire to escape his home and a bizarre scheme the boys discussed of stealing Danner's car and heading off to a new life. On the day of the crime, Colt obtained guns from inside his house and signaled Paul and another boy to join him. Paul went into the home through a window and, acting on Colt's cue, fired 2 shots at Danner. The 50-year-old man was hit multiple times and passed away in his living room. Moments later, the boys took his vehicle and attempted to flee, eventually being stopped by police hundreds of miles away. Because Indiana law at the time allowed even very young children to be tried as adults, Paul was charged and initially sentenced in adult. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit unaliving and received a 30-year prison sentence. David Braum. David Braum was a 16-year-old from Rochester, Minnesota, whose name became permanently linked to one of the most brutal family unaliving in the state's history. In February 1988, Braum carried out a violent attack inside his own home that left his entire family unalived. At the time, David lived with his parents, Bernard and Paulette Braum, and his younger siblings, 13-year-old Diane and 11-year-old Ricky. By most accounts, the family appeared stable from the outside, but tensions had reportedly been building between David and his parents. He had been in trouble at school, and disagreements at home had escalated in the weeks leading up to the killings. Late one night, after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, David armed himself with an axe. Moving through the house room by room, he attacked each member of his family. His parents and siblings were unalived in their beds, in what investigators later described as an extremely violent and deliberate act. The next day, he went to school as if nothing had happened. When police discovered the bodies and began investigating, attention quickly turned to David. He was arrested shortly afterward and charged with 4 counts of first-degree unaliving. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the killings were premeditated and carried out with clear intent. The defense focused on David's mental state and suggested he was suffering from severe psychological issues at the time. Despite these arguments, a jury found him guilty on all counts. David was ultimately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in prison. Mason Cisk. In 2019, Mason Cisk, who was regarded by friends and family members as a quiet, nerdy kid, shot and unalived his entire family. Mason was from the small town of Elkmont in Alabama, home to just about 5 to 100 residents. Everyone knew each other, and they knew the Cisk family, parents John and Mary, and the 4 kids, Mason, Grayson, Aurora, and Carlson. Mason was John's kid from a previous marriage, and his biological mother had passed away when he was 3 years old. Friends and family claimed that Mary had raised Mason since the age of 4 and treated him as her own, referring to herself as a mother of 4. At the time of the unaliving, Grayson was 6. Aurora was 4, and Carlson was only 6 months old. Investigators were called to the residence in 2019 by Mason, who claimed that he was playing video games in the basement when he heard gunshots. He claimed he rushed upstairs and witnessed a vehicle speeding away, and his entire family was shot. By the time investigators arrived, everyone in the house had been unalived, except Mason, who miraculously survived. They started questioning him immediately, and it was not long before he confessed. While there have been different theories over what could have led to Mason's snapping, he claimed that it was because his parents had fought a lot and he wanted out. His caseworker commented that Mason showed no remorse and did not ask about his family even once during the entire trial period. His lack of empathy for his family members and for the people he hurt was something that struck a nerve with the judge. Mason reacted calmly and showed no emotion when he was sentenced to a life behind bars in 2022. Raymond Childs. At just 17 years old, Raymond Childs committed one of the most horrific crimes ever recorded in Indianapolis's history. He was responsible for the mass unaliving of 6 people, including an unborn child, and received a life sentence for each crime, coming up to 360 years in prison. At 3 in the morning, on January 24th in 2021, police arrived at an Indianapolis home where neighbors claimed they had heard gunshots. Police arrived to find a 15-year-old lying outside on the porch, bleeding. They transported him to the hospital, where he claimed that his older brother, Raymond, had shot at their entire family. Police then found the bodies of Raymond's father, stepmother, siblings, and one of the siblings' pregnant girlfriend at the home, each having been shot multiple times. The 15-year-old survived the incident and claimed that Raymond had gotten into an argument with their father over violating his curfew and taking the family vehicle without permission. Later that night, he retrieved his father's gun and shot at the entire family. Raymond was apprehended within a few hours at a relative's house and calmly admitted to the mass unaliving. The child's family had been revered in the local community, especially Raymond's father, who was a youth mentor and had supported many local communities. The judge noted the ruthlessness of Raymond's crimes and did not buy the defense's argument that he was not acting like himself at the time of the unaliving. Nathaniel Brazil. In 2000, Nathaniel Brazil shot and unalived his school teacher, Barry Grunow. Nathaniel came from a broken household, and police noted a lot of violence surrounding him as he grew up. Still, he was described as a mild-mannered and overall well-liked student by his teachers. Nathaniel himself claimed that Barry was his favorite teacher. However, on the last day of the school year, 13-year-old Nathaniel was reprimanded by Barry for throwing water balloons and sent home early. Nathaniel then went home, retrieved a weapon, returned to school, and shot his teacher in the head, immediately unaliving him. He was then seen waving the gun around and threatening to shoot other teachers at the school as well. The prosecution wanted to charge Nathaniel with manslaughter, but reached a plea deal with the defense and agreed on a near-life term. Since 2000, Nathaniel has been incarcerated and will likely spend the next 30 years of his life, practically all of his life, while locked up. Carly Gregg. 14-year-old Carly Gregg had been a handful for her mother, Ashley, and stepfather, Heath Smiley. Reports showed that Carly had been on medication, was known for being reckless at school, and had been consuming large amounts of illegal substances. However, on March 19, 2024, things seemed relatively normal. That was also, unfortunately, the day that she decided to unalive her mother. Ashley had been a mathematics teacher at Northwest Rankin High School, where Carly studied. They came home together that evening, put their things aside, and went about their day. Investigators later claimed that Carly went into her parents' bedroom, retrieved their gun, and then shot her mother. She then texted Heath from her mother's phone, pretending to be her, and asking him to come home early. Heath claimed that Carly ambushed him when he came home, shooting aimlessly and even hitting him close to the neck before he managed to get the gun off her. Carly then ran outside of the home with a friend she had called earlier. Heath phoned the police immediately after finding his unalived wife. Carly was arrested almost immediately and confessed to everything. In court, prosecutors played CCTV footage from within the home, which showed Carly entering her parents' bedroom and then emerging with something hidden behind her back. It then showed her entering another room where screams could be heard. She then exited that room with the same item concealed behind her back and then texted Heath from the kitchen. Carly sobbed in court as evidence of her mother's unaliving was played out, including the 911 call made by Heath, where he was audibly heartbroken. She apologized in court, and her defense team claimed that Carly suffered from mental illness and would never have done something like this if she were properly medicated. The judge, however, rejected the defense and called Carly a monster. In the end, at just 14 years old, Carly Gregg was sentenced to life in prison. Cameron Herren. In 2018, 18-year-old Cameron Herren was racing against 17-year-old John Barinauer when Cameron noticed Jessica and Lilia Raubenolt attempting to cross the pedestrian ramp. Cameron was driving at 100 miles an hour, and the black box from his Mustang showed that the vehicle speed had come up to 30 miles per hour at the time of the crash, showing a hard brake. Witnesses claimed that they had noticed the cars racing all throughout the Bayshore Boulevard, with some even contacting the police about it. Jessica was a 24-year-old mother who came to South Tampa with her 21-month-old daughter to visit family. Jessica passed away at the scene, and Lilia passed away from her injuries at the hospital later that day. Cameron had a long history of reckless driving, which was noted by the prosecution. The judge agreed that this was a case of gross neglect and vehicular manslaughter, sentencing Cameron to almost 30 years behind bars. What was particularly ironic about this case, though, was the tremendous amount of online support Cameron received. Courtroom footage went viral online, with many coming to Cameron's defense, mostly because of his good looks. Many commented that Cameron was too cute for prison. His TikTok profile, despite not having any videos, now has over 2 million followers. Even Cameron's mother commented that netizens had an almost unhealthy obsession with her son. Mahek Bukari. Known online as Maybe, Mahek Bukari was a British-Pakistani social media influencer who had over 200,000 followers on TikTok and 50,000 followers on Instagram. Her content mostly focused on lifestyle, beauty, and daily vlogging with her mother, Ansreen Bukari. She had even won an award for the Best Social Media Star at the 2019 Brit Asia TV Music Awards. Mahek was from an affluent family, living in Leicestershire in the United Kingdom, and was known online for having a close, tight-knit relationship with her family. However, she gained attention in 2022 for causing the unaliving of 2 men, Saqib Hussain and Hashim Ijazuddin. What followed was an even more shocking revelation. Ansreen had been in a 3-year relationship with Saqib, who was 18 at the time the relationship began, 30 years younger than Ansreen. After the relationship ended, he began blackmailing her for money. Mahek, having learned the situation, tried to intervene and allegedly planned on harming Saqib to keep him quiet about the situation. In 2022, Saqib and Hashim were ambushed by Mahek and her friends at a Tesco parking lot, where they arrived after Ansreen had lured them there with the promise of paying Saqib £3,000. A high-speed chase ensued in which Saqib and Hashim's car was pushed off the road, crashing into a central reservation, catching fire, and unaliving the two instantly. The trial was highly publicized. There were people who sympathized with Mahek's position, and her defense team argued that she was under severe stress because of Saqib's blackmailing, which would have led to her parents' divorce. The court did, though, try Ansreen in a separate case, stating that she was equally responsible for what Mahek did. She cried repeatedly throughout the 10-week trial and was a mess when the judge sentenced her to serve a life term. However, in 2025, she successfully appealed her case and received a reduced sentence of 27 years. In any case, she will not be eligible for parole until 2050. Willard Miller. The small community of Fairfield was left shocked after investigators found the body of local Spanish teacher, Nohema Graber, disposed of near the rail tracks. Nohema had gone to the park earlier that day on her usual walk, but never returned. Investigators found her badly beaten, and later determined baseball bats were used in her unaliving. What followed was a shocking revelation. 2 of her students, Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale, both 16 at the time, had ambushed her in the park and unalived her. Why? Because Willard claimed that he had received a bad grade in his Spanish test from Nohema and had asked her repeatedly to improve his grade so he could apply to better colleges. Nohema refused, and he plotted with Jeremy to unalive her. The teen's defense claimed that he had only wanted to scare Nohema, but things escalated, and neither planned on actually causing her unaliving. In court, Willard tearfully read a letter to Nohema's friends and family members, claiming that things got out of hand and he was not acting like himself that evening. Nohema's family, however, was unmoved and asked that the judge see through his act. The judge did, and claimed that had it not been for his age, he would have sentenced him to a life term without parole. Currently, Jeremy's serving a 25 years to life sentence, and Willard is in prison for 35 years to life. Jake Evans. On October 6, 2012, a 911 operator listened calmly as 17-year-old Jake Evans recounted unaliving his mother and 15-year-old sister. Jake had just shot and unalived both his mother and sister in their family home, later calling 911 and staying on the line for 20 minutes to recount the entire incident. When asked what had motivated him to commit the act, he claimed that it was not anything specific. He said that he did not like people arguing, and that his mother and sister had been arguing earlier that day. Jake then went on to state that he was not a bad person and that this was very unlike him. Even community members agreed. They claimed that Jake was an overall good kid who would stay out of trouble. At the time of the incident, the father was away on a business trip. In a 4-page confession, Jake claimed that he had watched the horror remake, Halloween, about 3 times that week. He claimed that he was amazed at how easy it was for the unaliver in the movie to commit his crimes. He later wondered if it would be just as easy for him. Jake also claimed that he had initially planned on using a knife, but then decided to get through the deed as quickly as possible. The weapon was a .22 caliber he had stolen from his grandfather. The defense argued that Jake was a well-liked kid who was suffering from a mental breakdown at the time of the crime, but the prosecution pointed out that his sister was shot twice after Jake realized she had somehow survived the first shot. They also pointed out that after realizing one shot might not have been enough, Jake went back into the study and shot his already unalived mother in the head. The judge was sympathetic to Jake's mental condition, but also noted that he was a danger to society. In the end, Jake Evans was sentenced to a lifetime behind bars. Joshua Phillips. Melissa Phillips entered her 14-year-old son's room and found a horrific sight. Underneath Joshua Phillips' bed was the body of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, a neighbor's daughter who had been reported missing just a week prior. Melissa phoned the authorities immediately, who then apprehended Joshua at school. When he saw police approaching him, Joshua immediately confessed, but claimed that he did not commit the crime because he was a bad person. Instead, he claimed that on November 3rd, the 2 kids were playing when he accidentally hit Maddie. Fearful that his strict father would beat him for it, Joshua claimed that he acted on impulse and tried to unalive Maddie. This was what his defense argued in court, too. Joshua was distraught throughout the trial, repeatedly apologizing for what he had done, but claiming that he was not thinking straight. However, the prosecution argued that Joshua could have done anything besides unaliving an 8-year-old girl, or in any case could have told anyone in the week that she was hidden under his bed. Investigators also pointed out that Maddie was still alive when Joshua went back home the first time after strangling her, but that he stabbed her regardless. He even took part in search and rescue efforts to find her, sentencing him to serve out a life term. Seph Gonzalez. The Gonzalez family had relocated to Australia from the Philippines after the 1990 Luzon earthquake and completely rebuilt their life from scratch. Teddy Gonzalez was a respected lawyer in the community, and his wife, Loiva, and 2 kids, Seph and Claudine, were equally beloved in the Australian Filipino community. However, the community was left in shock after Seph unalived his entire family in 2001. According to investigators, Seph planned the unaliving after his family had threatened to disinherit him. He had dropped out of school, was rebellious, and had a girlfriend the family disapproved of. In 2001, he finally snapped and unalived his family members one by one as they returned to their Sydney home with a baseball bat and a kitchen knife. By 7 in the evening that day, Seph had unalived his entire family. He then went over to a friend's home by 8, spending the evening with him, even eating pizza and playing video games until close to midnight, before eventually being dropped off at home. Then, he played the scene, claiming he had just arrived home to find his entire family unalived. Seph even spray-painted racist slogans on the walls to make it look like a hate crime. However, investigators could see through his lies almost instantly. For starters, Seph was emotionally distant in the days after his family had just passed away, even acting odd at their funeral. He also visited the family accountant to transfer everything in his name, moved into an apartment in an affluent area, and put down a down payment on a Lexus. Police arrested him a few days after the crime, and prosecutors charged him almost immediately. In court, he continued to maintain his innocence, but a psychological evaluation showed that Seph was a pathological liar. They also found the same spray paint on his shoes as was used to write those racist slogans. While Seph pleaded that he was innocent, the judge sentenced him to serve out 3 life terms. each one of the unalivings he had committed. Some crimes are so disturbing that even judges struggle to believe the person responsible is still a child. These are cases where kids committed acts so extreme that entire courtrooms fell silent as their sentences were read. From emotionless stares to chilling smiles, these young offenders showed reactions that shocked the world. Here are evil kids whose courtroom moments were just as unsettling as their crimes. Number 12. Alyssa Bustamante. 15-year-old Alyssa lured 9-year-old Elizabeth Alton into the woods near their homes in St. Martins, Missouri. Alyssa was a troubled teen who had been living with her grandparents along with her 3 siblings after both her parents were unable to care for them. Friends and family had complained about Alyssa's behavior, claiming she showed disturbing tendencies. Alyssa convinced her younger sister to bring Elizabeth out to play. She then took both girls to the woods, where she made her sister wait further away. Alyssa then reportedly strangled Elizabeth before stabbing her 8 times in the chest. Once she was done, she dumped the 9-year-old's body in a shallow grave she had dug just a week prior. Investigators retrieved her journal, where she had described the event, claiming that it felt amazing and indicating that she would have done it again. However, just 2 days after the unaliving, Alyssa was arrested. In court, the defense argued that Alyssa was a troubled kid and even had experts come in to diagnose her with major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder. The defense painted Alyssa as a misunderstood teen who was just a victim like any other kid. The prosecution, however, claimed that this was not the case. They pointed out how Alyssa had plotted the unaliving for weeks, and even after she had committed the crime, she showed no remorse. They argued that she wanted to unalive more kids, and had she not been caught, who knows who would have been next. It was now all up to the judge, who sided with the prosecution, but accepted Alyssa's plea of second-degree unaliving. Her first parole hearing was in 2024, where she was denied an early release. Even if her life sentence for Elizabeth's unaliving is overturned, Alyssa would still have to serve out a concurrent 30-year sentence for possession of a dangerous weapon. In any case, the earliest she might ever be released would be when she is 65. Number 11. Morgan Geyser. Morgan Geyser had been best friends with Peyton Isabella since childhood, and together they befriended Anissa Wire. All 3 girls were 12 years old at the time of the crime in 2014, which makes the incident even more chilling. Morgan and Anissa bonded over their shared belief in the Slender Man, an internet legend originating from the site Creepypasta. They believed that the Slender Man was real and that he would come and attack them if they did not offer him a sacrifice. The 2 girls then hatched a plan to sacrifice their friend, Peyton. They lured her into the woods close to their homes in Waukesha, Wisconsin, where they convinced Peyton they just wanted to play hide and seek. However, they tackled Peyton to the ground, stabbed her 19 times, and then left her there. Peyton, miraculously, survived and managed to drag herself to the road where a cyclist called emergency services. According to the operating surgeon, if the blade had moved even an inch elsewhere, Peyton would not have made it. 5 hours after the attack, police apprehended Morgan and Anissa while they were on their way to a national forest where they claimed Slender Man lived. Both girls were tried as adults. Anissa's defense team argued that she was acting on whatever Morgan told her to do. Morgan's defense team argued that she had earlier been misdiagnosed and was actually suffering from childhood-onset schizophrenia. While the court agreed with both defenses, it did not undermine the severity of their crimes. Anissa served time and was eventually released into her father's custody. She will be under state supervision until she is 37. Meanwhile, Morgan's sentence was longer, and she repeatedly got into trouble with the law and her caseworkers for her behavior, including an escape in 2020, which made things worse for her. Peyton stated that while she has trauma from the event, she is slowly trying to move past it. Number 10. Jamarian Lawhorn. In 2014, at just 12 years old, Jamarian Lawhorn became the youngest convict in Kent County's history. Jamarian came from an abusive household where his mother was neglectful, and his stepfather would beat and berate the kids over minor offenses. Psychiatrists later claimed that because of trouble at home, Jamarian had been suffering from an undiagnosed depressive disorder. Still, the prosecution argued that it was no excuse for what he did. In 2014, Jamarian took a kitchen knife, went up to 9-year-old Connor Verkirk, and stabbed him multiple times. Connor's brother ran home to inform their mother, while Jamarian calmly went inside a neighbor's home. There, he told the neighbor that he had just committed a crime and asked for 911 to be called. According to the neighbor, Jamarian sat there quietly, waiting for the police, and only spoke when he saw police approaching the wrong house. "I'm here." Jamarian's trial was short. The defense did not have a strong case, but they argued for leniency given Jamarian's childhood circumstances. The judge and prosecution, and even Connor's family, agreed that he was a misunderstood child who deserved a second chance. Reportedly, Connor's grandmother tried her best to visit Jamarian while he was incarcerated. Because of his behavior while locked up, Jamarian was granted an early release in 2021. Number 9. Cindy Collier and Shirley Wolfe. In June 1983, just 8 hours after they had first met each other, Cindy and Shirley decided they were going to unalive someone. The two troubled teens had met at a juvenile facility and had met at a group home earlier that day. They later called one another kindred spirits and wanted to start a life together. They decided to steal a car from an elderly woman in Auburn, California, and began knocking on doors. After 2 failed attempts, they reached Anna Brackett's residence. The woman let them in, chatted with them for an hour, and was then ambushed by the girls, who began strangling and stabbing the 85-year-old. At the time of the unaliving, Cindy was 15 and Shirley was 14. The girls could not find the keys to Anna's car, so the unaliving was essentially for nothing. Later that day, when they were arrested, they confessed to the crime, calling it lots of fun. Shirley confessed first, and Cindy admitted during interrogation that they did it without any remorse. The defense pointed out how both girls came from horribly abusive backgrounds and that they were suffering from past trauma and mental health issues. The judge took the defense's pleas into consideration, but the prosecution argued that it should not undermine the severity of the crimes they had committed, especially considering the fact that they had just unalived a random old woman on nothing more than an impulse. The girls were sentenced to a juvenile facility and ultimately paroled within the next decade. Both girls have since expressed remorse for their actions, even though they were anything but sorry at the time of the unaliving. Shirley even wrote on Anna's online obituary in 2014, "I am truly sorry. I am 45 now, and I wish I could turn back time. No words can undo my damage. You were a kind and sweet lady. Should have been me, not you." Number 8. Daniel Marsh. In 2013, after years of homicidal tendencies, Daniel Marsh claimed he had enough. The 15-year-old left his mother's residence in Davis, California, and began searching for open doors and windows in the neighborhood. He eventually reached the home of Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup, an elderly couple. Daniel made his way into the home through a screen door, waited for a while in the living room, before he heard snoring noises coming from upstairs. He then went up to the couple's bedroom, where he reportedly watched them sleep for a couple of minutes. That was when Daniel claimed Claudia woke up, saw him, and started screaming. He began stabbing her and Oliver several times. According to the coroner's report, the couple had each been stabbed over 60 times, their bodies later mutilated. The case made headlines because of its severity and randomness. Nothing was stolen from the home. It was not until several months later that Daniel was arrested after he had bragged about the crime to a friend, who then went on and reported it. Daniel was arrested that very same day, and he confessed almost immediately. He claimed that he was driven by the voices he had been hearing in his head since he was 10 years old. The defense team pointed out that Daniel had been suffering from several mental health disorders and was on heavy medication at the time of the unaliving. The prosecution argued that he showed a chilling level of depravity when committing the crimes. Not only had he targeted the home at random, but he also stood over the couple for several minutes before committing overkill. To make it worse, he even dismembered their bodies before fleeing the scene. The prosecution also pointed out that Daniel was unapologetic and did not come forward with the crime himself. He even told investigators that he felt a dopamine rush from committing the unaliving. The judge noted the depravity and also Daniel's lack of remorse, sentencing him to a life behind bars. Number 7. Jordan Brown. In 2009, Jordan Brown was arrested for the suspected unaliving of his father's pregnant fiancée, Kenzie Hoke. The police were alerted to a possible crime at the New Beaver, Pennsylvania, residence by Kenzie's 7-year-old daughter. They soon started interrogating Jordan, who was 11 years old at the time, and determined that he had unalived Kenzie with his hunting shotgun. Jordan claimed he was innocent, but there was enough evidence to suggest that he had been the culprit. The defense tried to argue that it was likely Kenzie's ex-boyfriend who had earlier made threats against her and her new family, but the prosecution was fixated on Jordan. His friends and family cried in court, including his father, Chris Brown, who claimed that Jordan was arrested for something he had not done. The case gathered significant controversy. Because of the judge's decision to try the 11-year-old as an adult. He was subsequently sent to a juvenile facility and faced a possibility of a life behind bars with parole after 25 years. However, in 2013, his case was called again after the defense provided new evidence. The time Jordan was released and exonerated, but then, in 2018, a new trial was called. Because of double jeopardy laws, Jordan cannot be tried for the same crime ever again. To this day, there are people out there who believe that he really did shoot Kenzie in the back of her head while she was sleeping, pointing toward the shotgun and the missing shot case. They even assert that the shot case was later found on Jordan's route to school, further proving he was the criminal. However, now 28 years old, Jordan continues to claim his innocence. Whether he did or did not unalive his father's 8-month pregnant fiancée is something we will probably never know. Number 6. Joshua Young, probably one of the most twisted cases you have ever heard of. In 2011, 14-year-old Terry Zwicker was found unalived behind Liberty High School in East Indiana. Terry, an honor roll student, was visiting his mother and stepfather at the time of the unaliving. The couple, Amanda McFarland and Josh Gooker, also lived with Josh's 15-year-old son, Joshua Young. Joshua was initially charged as a suspect in Terry's unaliving. He was arrested and sentenced to a life term. However, in 2013, Josh stepped forward and claimed that he had unalived Terry. He claimed that he was angry with Terry for stealing a lighter and also frustrated with his mother and decided to fatally attack him. He claimed he used a metal pipe, but the weapon was never retrieved. Josh claimed he acted alone, which allowed a new trial for Joshua. This time, Joshua was released. But the case took another turn in 2014, when Josh claimed he had lied to save his son and that he was not actually involved in Terry's unaliving. However, the judge denied his pleas to toss his conviction. Since then, Josh has been begging his son to come forward with the truth. Since his release, Joshua has continued getting into trouble with the law, including several cases of domestic violence, firearm possession, and other offenses. Terry's father, Trey, has always maintained that Joshua was the real culprit and should be in prison. In 2014, they sat face-to-face on the Dr. Phil show, where Joshua maintained his innocence, claiming, "I'm looking into your eyes and telling you, I did not unalive your son." Josh joined the conversation via video conference and again begged his son to tell the truth. Dr. Phil claimed that he could see innocence in Joshua's eyes. But the case took yet another turn in 2019, when Joshua wrote a 4-page letter confessing to the crime. His motive was simply that he did not like his stepbrother. Despite his confession, legal experts claim that it likely will not overturn Josh's conviction, and that, because of double jeopardy laws, Joshua probably will not be tried for Terry's mother, despite Trey's advocacy. This essentially means that an unaliver is free with no consequences whatsoever. Number 5. Michael Hernandez. In 2004, Michael Hernandez lured his supposed best friend, 14-year-old Jaime Goff, to their Southwood Middle School bathroom, where he then stabbed him multiple times, taking his life. Michael was arrested shortly afterward and confessed immediately. He claimed that he was not in control of the situation and something took over him. The defense tried to use this to prove that he was clinically insane at the time of the unalivings, but the prosecution painted a different picture entirely. They showed evidence that suggested Michael was fascinated with the idea of becoming a serial unaliver and was inspired by notorious criminals like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. They also claimed that despite his arrest, Michael would call his father from prison and ask him to put heavy metal music on the receiver for him. Michael was also obsessed with Adolf Hitler and had expressed his interests on becoming notorious before as well. Jamie's parents stood in court, claiming that their son had no idea his best friend would do something so horrible, and argued that Michael was in full control of his actions that day. In 2008, a judge rejected Michael's insanity plea and ordered him to spend the rest of his life in prison. But then, in 2021, reports surfaced that Michael, by then 31 years old, had passed away from an unknown illness while behind bars. Number 4. Christopher Pitman. In 2001, Christopher, who now goes by Kirsten, unalived her grandparents, Joe and Joy Pitman. At just 10 years old, Kristen was sent to live with her paternal grandparents after her mother walked out on the family, and her father claimed that she had become a handful. Kristen had previously run away from home and was later brought back and released into her grandparents' care. Apparently, for the next few years of her life, Kristen saw some form of stability, but that was because she had been receiving medication for her mental health condition. When she was 12 years old, Kristen's medication changed, and that was when things started to turn ugly. Apparently, Kristen was out of control and had to routinely be reprimanded for her actions. On the morning of the unaliving, she had reportedly choked a child on the school bus and been disruptive in church. Angered by her grandparents reprimanding her, Kristen snuck into their room in the middle of the night, unalived them with a shotgun, stole valuables, and ran away in their vehicle. When she was found 2 counties away, she claimed that an intruder had broken into the home, unalived her family, burned the house down, and then kidnapped her. During interrogation, however, she confessed. While her crime was severe enough to guarantee a life behind bars, the defense argued that she was not in the right mental headspace because she had been denied her usual prescription. Her case went through significant controversy. Kristen's life sentence was ultimately revoked for a 20-year prison term, which she completed in 2023 and was released. Number 3. Daniel Petrick. Daniel Petrick was 16 years old when he carried out a shocking attack on his own parents in Ohio in 2006. It all began with a video game. Daniel had become obsessed with playing Halo, but his strict parents did not allow violent games in the house. When they found out he was secretly playing, they took the game away and locked it in a safe with a handgun. Daniel became fixated on getting the game back. One evening, he found the key to the safe and took both the game and the weapon. He walked into the living room where his parents were sitting together and told them to close their eyes because he had a surprise for them. Trusting their son, they did. Moments later, he fired. His mother was unalived, and his father was badly injured but survived. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Daniel planned everything carefully. They said he knew exactly what he was doing when he took the key, opened the safe, and waited for the right moment. The defense told a very different story. They argued that Daniel was deeply addicted to video games and mentally unwell. They claimed he was disconnected from reality and did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. As the judge spoke about the crime and its impact, Daniel sobbed. When the sentence of 23 years to life was announced, he cried uncontrollably, claiming he loved both his parents. His father, also a victim, tried to claim that Daniel was regretful of his actions and should be released. To this day, Daniel remains in custody and will not be eligible for parole until 2023. Number 2. Joseph Hall. In 2011, Joseph lived in California with his parents. His father, Jeff Hall, was known for being involved in extremist groups and often spoke about hateful beliefs at home. Joseph grew up surrounded by this environment. One night, while his father slept on the living room couch, Joseph picked up a revolver from the house. He walked quietly into the room and fired at close range. His father was unalived instantly. Joseph then calmly went back to his bedroom and waited until morning, when his younger sister discovered what had happened. The case quickly drew national attention because of Joseph's age. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Joseph knew exactly what he was doing. They said he had practiced with weapons before and had talked about unaliving his father. To them, this was a planned act, not a childish mistake. The defense argued something very different. They said Joseph was a deeply troubled child who had grown up in a toxic and extremist home. According to them, he had been exposed to violence and hateful ideas from a very early age. They claimed he did not fully understand the weight of his actions and needed psychological help rather than severe punishment. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 40 years to life in prison, meaning he would spend most of his life behind bars for something he did before even reaching his teenage years. Number 1. Eric Smith. Eric Smith was just 13 years old when he committed a crime that shocked his small town and the entire country. In 1993, Eric lived in a quiet area of New York. He was known as a troubled kid who had been bullied at school for years. One summer day, 4-year-old Derek Roby wandered away from a nearby park. Eric saw the younger boy alone and led him into a wooded area. There, he attacked him in a brutal way that horrified investigators and the local community. When the case went to trial, prosecutors argued that Eric knew exactly what he was doing. They said he carefully led the child away from the public and then tried to hide what he had done. The defense focused on Eric's troubled childhood. They said he had been severely bullied, struggled socially, and showed signs of serious mental and emotional problems. His lawyers argued that he was a deeply disturbed teenager who needed long-term treatment, not just punishment. Eric's reaction in court became one of the most talked about parts of the case. He often sat with an unusual expression on his face, sometimes smirking or staring blankly as graphic details were described. People in the courtroom were unsettled by how calm he appeared. It was difficult for many to understand how someone so young could show so little visible emotion. He was eventually sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. Eric spent decades behind bars before finally being granted parole as an adult, after serving more than 25 years for the crime. From children who did not know any better to teenagers who found themselves with the wrong group of people, these are some of the most heartbreaking sentences for kids of all time. Kalief Browder. A lot of things went wrong in Kalief Browder's case. In 2010, the African-American youth was stopped in the Bronx neighborhood during what he believed was a routine stop and frisk. However, what he did not know was that a man named Roberto Bautista had identified Kalief and a friend of his from the back of a squad car as the two thieves who stole his backpack containing valuables just a few days prior. When the police stopped Kalief and his friend, they both denied involvement in the crime and did not have any of Roberto's alleged valuables on them. Roberto himself later asserted that he could not be sure that both boys were indeed the thieves. Still, the boys were taken to the precinct where they were held without letting their parents come into the interrogation room. A few hours into holding, the police announced that Kalief had confessed to the crime. He was charged, fingerprinted, and his bail was set at $3,000. Kalief was living with a foster family at the time, and they did not have the money to make his bond or to pay the bail bondsman. When a neighbor offered to put up the bond, he was told that Kalief's probation officer, from another crime Kalief claimed he had not committed, had put a hold on his bond. He was taken to Rikers Island to await trial and resolution of the probation matter. This still was not the worst of it all. At Rikers Island, Kalief claimed that he was routinely harassed, especially by other guards. In one instance, he had a physical altercation with another inmate, after which he was placed in solitary confinement for over 2 years. All of which was happening before his trial had even begun. Kalief's attorney, Brendan O'Meara, claimed that his trial was prolonged because of a backlog in the judicial system. Brendan also claimed that every time Kalief would appear in front of a judge, the same thing would happen. The judge would tell him to admit guilt, serve 2 years plus time served, and Kalief would deny the charges every single time. This went on until 2013 when Roberto returned to Mexico and could not make it to trial. Kalief was released that same day. But Kalief continued to fight for justice. He claimed that the system had worked against him and discriminated against him. He also claimed that the guards at Rikers Island had repeatedly harmed him and other inmates. While Kalief was released with a GED education, he did not attend college. It later emerged that Kalief was suffering from depression because of his time in solitary confinement. Moreover, Kalief had tried ending his life several times. The first time, he claimed, he was goaded by the guards at Rikers. In 2015, his mother found him hanging outside his bedroom window by the air conditioning unit. Kalief was 22 at the time of his passing. His case sparked a larger conversation on illegal imprisonments, forced confessions, and the negative impacts of solitary confinement. It became a turning point in the United States judicial system, with many errors in Kalief's case being presented as evidence for reform. While several charities and initiatives were started in his honor, it is a shame Kalief did not live long enough to see them come through. Derek Bentley. Derek Bentley's case remains one of the most controversial executions in British history. In 1952, 19-year-old Derek and his 16-year-old friend Christopher Craig attempted to break into a confectionery warehouse in Croydon, England. Craig was carrying a revolver, while Bentley had only a knife and a knuckle duster. When neighbors spotted the pair climbing onto the roof of the building, police were called to the scene. As officers arrived and climbed up to confront them, events quickly spiraled out of control. During the confrontation, a police officer named Frederick Fairfax tried to arrest Bentley. At that moment, Craig still had the weapon. According to police testimony, Bentley shouted the words, "Let him have it, Chris." Craig then opened fire, wounding Fairfax before another officer, Police Constable Sidney Miles, climbed onto the roof. Craig fired again, unaliving Miles with a shot to the head. Both boys were arrested and charged with unaliving. However, the case soon took a controversial turn. Craig had fired the gun and admitted to shooting the officer, but because he was only 16, British law at the time prevented him from receiving the ultimate penalty. Bentley's lawyers appealed the verdict, pointing to the unclear evidence, his mental condition, and the fact that he had not fired the gun. The appeal failed. On January 28, 1953, Derek Bentley was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. He was only 19 years old. The execution sparked outrage across Britain. More than 200 members of Parliament signed petitions asking for clemency, and protests took place outside the prison. Many believed Bentley had been unfairly punished for a crime he did not physically commit. Decades later, those concerns were finally acknowledged. In 1993, Bentley received a posthumous royal pardon, and in 1998, the Court of Appeal officially overturned his conviction, declaring that he had been denied a fair trial. Today, Derek's case is widely remembered as a tragic miscarriage of justice and one of the key cases that helped push the United Kingdom toward abolishing the death penalty. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Brown's case highlights many flaws in the judicial system and in society as a whole. Born to an alcoholic mother and an unknown father, Cyntoia was placed for adoption. While she claimed that her adopted family was kind and loving, she was disruptive and rebellious. Eventually, she was placed under state care, but managed to run away from state care several times. Eventually, she made her way from Kentucky to Nashville, where she met Garion McLaughlin. Over the course of the next year, Garion would harm the 16-year-old repeatedly and force her into work she did not want to partake in. In 2004, Cyntoia was approached by 43-year-old Johnny Allen Michael. While he worked as a real estate agent, Sunday school preacher, and youth pastor, and had even set up a ministry for the homeless, Cyntoia claimed that he approached her and propositioned her. While Johnny's family claimed that this could not have been the case at all, and that Johnny was likely only helping her, both the prosecution and defense argued otherwise. The only question was whether she had intended on unaliving him premeditatedly or whether she was actually in fear for her life. According to the prosecution, Cyntoia shot Johnny in the head with his firearm as he slept. She then stole his truck and close to $200 from his wallet and left the scene. She later abandoned the vehicle in a Walmart parking lot before returning the next day. According to the prosecution's witness, Cyntoia planned on robbing Johnny's residence yet again. This was what the prosecution based their entire case on. However, the defense claimed that she was just a 16-year-old who had been trafficked, and this was the only way she knew how to survive. Still, the judge claimed that Cyntoia's behavior showed her lack of remorse for the crime and that she was not in any imminent danger when she shot and unalived Johnny. She was tried as an adult and sentenced to serving a life term with the possibility of parole when she was 67 years old. While in prison, Cyntoia turned her life around, earned her GED, and enrolled in college, where she had a perfect GPA. She also continued to fight her case. In 2013, Cyntoia's case gained renewed interest when several celebrities petitioned for her release. They argued that she never denied shooting Johnny, but that the judge overlooked the circumstances of the case. She was only 16, came from a broken background, and was trafficked. They also asserted that Johnny had a dark side, and that the prosecution repeatedly dismissed the defense's attorneys who testified against Johnny as irrelevant. In 2013, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam commuted her original sentence, setting her release date for 2019. After being released, Cyntoia continued to advocate for other young girls and women who were trafficked and faced harm. George Stinney Jr. In 2004, 60 years after he had been executed for allegedly unaliving two girls, an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, there was renewed interest in George Stinney's case. In 1994, 14-year-old George Stinney was tried for the unaliving of two white girls in Pinewood, South Carolina. According to witnesses, George was seen guiding the two girls as they approached him to ask for the site to find maypops. The girls' bodies were found in a ditch, with the coroner claiming that they had been beaten with an object several times, contributing to their passing. George's father even assisted in finding the girls' bodies, but just a few hours later, the sheriff announced that George Stinney Jr. was charged with the crime. Several acts of injustice were carried out. The sheriff did not have probable cause to arrest George. He was a 14-year-old who was questioned without his parents present at the interrogation, an alleged confession was signed without counsel present, and George was declared a criminal without due process being carried out. The trial officially began after an 81-day confinement during which George's family was not allowed to visit him. His father was fired from his job at the sawmill, and the family had to relocate from Pinewood because of repeated threats. In April 1994, George's case officially began. Again, several things went wrong here. There was an all-white jury trying the case, and George's state-appointed attorney did not contest anything the prosecution claimed. At one point, the prosecution contradicted itself when it presented two different versions of what they claimed George had told the sheriff. In one case, they claimed that George had unalived the young girls in self-defense after they attacked him first, and in the other case, they claimed that George had stalked the girls and attacked them. The state-appointed attorney also did not question the fact that there was no signed confession, just the sheriff's word against a 14-year-old. George's side also did not present any witnesses or anyone to testify in his favor. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and returned with a guilty verdict that same day. George Stinney Jr. was executed via electrocution on June 16th that year. He became the youngest convict in the United States history, executed at the age of 14. For the next 60 years, there was interest in George's case, but it was not until 2004 that George was finally exonerated. Besides the court's handling of the case, attorneys acting on the Stinney family's behalf claimed that there had been other suspects at the time of George's arrest, including a wealthy white man, George Burke. The attorneys claimed that there was more evidence than not to suggest that the girls were unalived at another location and their bodies had been dumped in the area. Ironically, while everyone else celebrated George's exoneration, the families of the two young victims did not. They claimed that George's portrayal as a pitiful young boy was far from the truth. They claimed that he confessed to unaliving the girls at least thrice during his incarceration. Again, the boys' attorneys claimed that the confessions were George's last, desperate attempt at clemency, which was denied repeatedly by South Carolina's governor. In any case, George Stinney Jr. was denied due process, a fact that remains undisputed, even by those who do not agree with his exoneration. Lionel Tate. In January 2021, Lionel Tate became the youngest American to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At just 13 years old, Lionel was sentenced for the 1999 unaliving of his cousin, 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick. The case was controversial for several reasons, but we have to go back to where it all began. On July 28, 1999, Lionel's mother, Kathleen, was supposed to babysit her 6-year-old niece, Tiffany. Kathleen left the two kids downstairs in their Broward County home while she went to do some chores upstairs. The last thing she remembered happening downstairs was the kids watching wrestling on television. Approximately 45 minutes later, Lionel rushed upstairs to tell his mother that Tiffany was not breathing. Kathleen told the court that her niece had bruising all over her body. She was pronounced unalived at the scene, and the autopsy report revealed that she suffered other injuries included a fractured skull, lacerated liver, fractured rib, and swollen brain. This became a criminal matter after doctors claimed that Tiffany's injuries were intense, and it was likely that the beating lasted for several minutes. While Lionel told officers that he was playing wrestling with his cousin and did not anticipate anything bad happening, the state attorney disagreed. Kenneth Padowitz, the prosecutor, argued that Lionel knew exactly what he was doing, and there had to come a point where he would have realized he was injuring Tiffany to a near-fatal extent. The defense attorney, however, claimed that Lionel was only 12 at the time of the attack and had in no way premeditated unaliving his cousin. A controversial issue in Lionel's case became the Florida statute that argued that the jury had to convict Lionel of first-degree unaliving even if they believed he did not intend on unaliving Tiffany. All the prosecution needed to show was that Lionel's actions contributed to Tiffany's passing. In 2001, Judge Joel Lazarus returned with a guilty verdict, sentencing Lionel to life behind bars without parole. The case was controversial for several reasons. Lionel was only 13. The Florida statute did not require showing criminal intent, and the prosecution later openly joined the defense in appealing Lionel's case. Judge Lazarus criticized the prosecution, stating that if they disagreed with the verdict, they should never have moved forward with a first-degree conviction. But, in any case, their efforts were successful, and Lionel's original sentence was overturned in 2004. They managed to figure out a loophole, showing that Lionel was denied due process when his mental competency was not checked ahead of the trial. This meant that his punishment was a year's house arrest and 10 years probation. While this should have been considered a win for everyone, especially Lionel, the case unfortunately became a tragic tale. In 2005, after only a year out of prison and while still 18, Lionel found himself back in front of a judge. This time, he stood accused of using a weapon to intimidate a pizza delivery man and then burglarizing a friend of his. The delivery man phoned the police and later returned with officers to identify Lionel. In 2006, Lionel admitted to violating his parole by acquiring a weapon, but refused to tell officers where he had disposed of it. This meant a heavier penalty, with some believing the Florida circuit judges wanted to make an example out of Lionel. He was sentenced to 30 years for violating his parole, which is being served concurrently with a 10-year sentence for robbery. As of 2007, Lionel Tate is still in prison. Abdullah al-Hueti. Abdullah al-Hueti's case became one of the most controversial juvenile justice cases in Saudi Arabia, raising international concerns about the treatment of minors within the country's legal system. In 2017, when Abdullah was just 14 years old, a robbery and an unaliving took place at a jewelry store in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia. According to investigators, a group of masked attackers stormed the store, unaliving a security guard and stealing valuable jewelry. Authorities quickly launched an investigation and arrested several suspects, including Abdullah al-Hueti. During the early stages of the investigation, Abdullah reportedly confessed to being involved in the crime. Prosecutors relied heavily on that confession to build their case. However, Abdullah later told the court that the confession had been forced and that he had been beaten and pressured by investigators while in custody. His lawyers argued that he had signed documents without fully understanding them and that he had been interrogated without proper legal representation. They also claimed there was evidence placing Abdullah somewhere else at the time of the robbery, suggesting that he could not have participated in the attack. Despite these claims, a criminal court convicted Abdullah of unaliving and robbery. Under Saudi law at the time, juveniles could still face the maximum penalty in certain serious cases, including unaliving. The court sentenced Abdullah al-Hueti to capital punishment, sparking immediate criticism from human rights organizations around the world. Groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch argued that the sentence violated international standards for juvenile justice. They pointed out that international law, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, prohibits the execution of individuals for crimes committed when they were under 18 years old. Advocates also raised concerns about the reliability of Abdullah's confession and the allegations that it had been obtained through coercion. According to activists following the case, the prosecution had not presented strong physical evidence linking Abdullah directly to the crime scene. In 2020, Saudi Arabia announced legal reforms that were intended to reduce the use of the capital penalty for minors. These reforms stated that individuals who committed crimes while under the age of 18 would no longer face execution in most cases and would instead receive prison sentences capped at a maximum number of years. However, activists pointed out that the reforms did not automatically apply to every case, leaving uncertainty about Abdullah's fate. After several appeals and years of legal battles, a Saudi appeals court eventually overturned Abdullah al-Hueti's sentence. The court ordered a retrial, acknowledging concerns about the evidence and the circumstances surrounding his confession. The decision offered a glimmer of hope for his supporters, who had spent years campaigning for a fair review of the case. Jordan Brown. In 2009, at the age of 11, Jordan Brown found himself standing in front of a judge, claiming that he did not unalive his stepmother. On the morning of February 20th, a 4-year-old was found sitting outside, crying. Tree cutters from nearby were alerted, and the young child told them that her mother was not responding. They went inside to find 26-year-old, pregnant Kenzie Houck shot in the side of her head. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors declared her and her unborn child deceased. Kenzie's fiancé, Eric, was at work, and their 2 kids, Eric's 11-year-old son, Jordan Brown, and Kenzie's 7-year-old daughter, were on their way to school. The police arrived at the scene and believed that Kenzie was shot in close range by a shotgun while she slept. They interviewed the children and immediately believed Jordan had something to do with it. Police officers believed that the unaliving weapon was the shotgun Jordan used on weekends to hunt with his father, a Christmas present. They also found a shell casing on Jordan's usual route to work. Jordan was interviewed twice on the day of Kenzie's unaliving, and by 3 o'clock that morning, police formally charged Jordan with the crime against his stepmother. According to the prosecution, Jordan detested his stepmother, his stepsisters, and his father's unborn child, believing that he would soon be replaced by the new baby. Prosecutors argued that Jordan had premeditated the crime and used his hunting shotgun to commit the act. But the defense claimed something else entirely. They claimed that the prosecution was heavily invested in circumstantial evidence and was not looking at a much more probable suspect, Kenzie's ex-boyfriend, Adam Harvey. Adam had been told a few days prior that he was not the father of Kenzie's 4-year-old, and he had a drunken encounter with some of Kenzie's family members just 8 hours prior to when Kenzie was found unalived. Adam, however, claimed that he had spent the night at his parents' basement and then later went to meet a friend, establishing an alibi. Jordan's defense also claimed that Adam had only just moved some 10 miles from Kenzie's new home, asserting that he was there to spy on his ex. But what made the case even more sensational was the fact that the prosecution argued for Jordan to be tried as an adult. Under Pennsylvania law, an adult committing a first-degree unaliving would be sentenced to a life term without parole. In a juvenile case, however, he would be sentenced till he turned 21. Amnesty International stepped in to advocate for Jordan's case to be heard in juvenile court, but even there, the judge found that he had in fact unalived his stepmother. It was not until June of 2016 that Jordan was released from prison, placed under house arrest. However, Jordan, his father, and their attorneys continued to fight his case, claiming that he was wrongfully accused. In 2013, Jordan managed to fight his way to a retrial where a board of judges sat together to discuss the case. They came to a 5-0 decision in favor of having Jordan's record expunged. They claimed that there was just as much evidence to suggest that he was not the unaliver as there was to claim that he was. But Jordan's journey was not over just yet. He claimed that, as a result of his incarceration, he now suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Jordan also claimed that he and his family had to move away from New Beaver because Kenzie's family still believed he was the unaliver. In 2024, Jordan unsuccessfully tried to sue the state troopers who arrested him, alleging that they violated his 5th and 6th Amendment rights. That case was ultimately dismissed. The Free Grace case. The media only knows her as Grace, a 15-year-old black girl from Beverly Hills, Michigan, whose case gained national attention when she was sent to juvenile detention for missing her online homework. Grace had 2 run-ins with the law in 2018, one for a domestic dispute with her mother and another for theft after she had stolen a cell phone out of someone's locker. For those 2 cases, she was placed on probation. In 2020, when the world shut down for COVID and classes moved online, Grace found it particularly hard to adjust. She had already been diagnosed with ADHD and had a hard time coping with online classes. In June 2020, Grace's probation officer advocated for residential treatment, alleging that she had anger management issues. The judge rejected the idea and instead placed her under intensive probation. But then, a few weeks later, her probation officer petitioned the court again, this time arguing for juvenile detention. Why? Because the 15-year-old had slept during a call made by the probation officer, and when the school was contacted, Grace's teacher claimed she had missed an assignment. However, the teacher also claimed that this was not unusual behavior in Grace's class. Judge Brennan presided over the case and stated that Grace had violated the terms of her probation when she missed her schoolwork. She sentenced Grace to be incarcerated at the Children's Village Juvenile Detention Center. The judge called Grace a threat to the community and stated that she had not fulfilled the expectation with regard to school performance. Grace and her mother requested that she be returned home at an early June court status hearing. Instead, Judge Brennan reaffirmed that Grace should continue to be incarcerated to get needed mental health services. Critics quickly argued that the punishment was excessive and ignored the widespread academic disruption students were experiencing during remote learning. Disability advocates and juvenile justice reform groups said the ruling reflected deeper systemic problems, including the over-criminalization of black youth and racial disparities within the juvenile justice system. The case gained national attention after a ProPublica article about her situation went viral in July 2020 under the hashtag #FreeGrace, sparking a Change.org petition that gathered more than 250,000 signatures and drawing support from members of Congress, the ACLU of Michigan, and local officials who argued students should not be punished for missing homework during the pandemic. Protests followed, including a car, caravan, and demonstrations outside her school and the Oakland County Courthouse, where activists and Black Lives Matter supporters demanded her release. Despite these calls, Judge Mary Ellen Brennan initially refused to release Grace during a July 20th hearing, saying doing so would be a mistake. However, after 78 days in detention, the Michigan Court of Appeals ordered her release on July 31st, allowing her to return home while still remaining on probation. Grace and her mother later thanked supporters who had pushed for her freedom. Paul Gingerich. In April 2010, 12-year-old Paul Gingerich and his friends, 15-year-old Colt Lundy and 15-year-old Chase Williams, planned to unalive Colt's stepfather, Philip Danner, in their home in Indiana. According to investigators, the three boys had discussed the idea beforehand and agreed that the only way Colt could escape what they described as strict discipline at home was to eliminate his stepfather. On the night of the attack, Colt stole one of his stepfather's handguns. When Philip entered the garage, Colt fired the shotgun, unaliving him. The boys fled the scene afterward, but were caught in the stolen vehicle not too long away from the crime scene. What made the case particularly controversial was Paul's age. At just 12 years old, he was barely a teenager, yet prosecutors charged him with unaliving and conspiracy. Instead of keeping the case in juvenile court, a judge ruled that Paul would be tried as an adult. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Paul had been an active participant in planning the unaliving. They claimed the group had discussed the crime beforehand, and that Paul had helped set the plan in motion. Paul's lawyers argued that he was easily influenced by the older boys and did not fully understand the consequences of what was being planned. Eventually, Paul accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit unaliving and was sentenced to 25 years. Critics immediately questioned whether a child as young as 12 should ever be placed in an adult prison. Juvenile justice advocates argued that the decision ignored decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Paul had been an active participant in planning the unaliving. They claimed the group had discussed the crime beforehand and that Paul had helped set the plan in motion. Paul's lawyers argued that he was easily influenced by the older boys and did not fully understand the consequences of what was being planned. Eventually, Paul accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit unaliving and was sentenced to 25 years. Critics immediately questioned whether a child as young as 12 should ever be placed in an adult prison. Juvenile justice advocates argued that the decision ignored decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing and that young offenders are far more capable of rehabilitation than adults. Paul's case continued to attract attention from legal experts and advocacy groups. Several organizations argued that his sentence was excessive and that he should have been tried in juvenile court instead. Appeals eventually reached the Indiana Supreme Court, which reviewed the circumstances of his sentencing. The court ultimately ruled that the original punishment was inappropriate for someone his age and ordered that he be resentenced. In 2013, after serving several years in prison, Paul was resentenced and transferred to a juvenile facility. In 2016, after spending nearly 6 years in custody, Paul was finally released. Jamarian Lawhorn. In 2014, on a quiet and peaceful day, 12-year-old Jamarian Lawhorn made his way to the playground where 9-year-old Connor Verkerker was playing with his brother. The two boys grew up in the same Kentwood area, knew one another, and had even played together. This day, however, Jamarian did not approach Connor to play. In an act no one could have seen coming, Jamarian lunged at Connor, stabbing him repeatedly with a kitchen knife. He then calmly left the scene and made his way to a neighbor's house. Connor's brother rushed home to tell their parents what had just happened, and by the time Connor could be taken to the hospital, he was already unalived. Meanwhile, Jamarian went up to his neighbor's house and calmly asked to call the police. He got on the phone with 911 himself, alerting them that he had just unalived the 9-year-old. According to the neighbor, Jamarian sat patiently on the couch, not making a sound. He only spoke when he saw officers approaching the playground from the window, and only to inform them where he was so they could arrest him. The officers arrested him, and that was when they realized that Jamarian wanted this to happen. He had called 911, telling them his crime, and asked for the maximum possible punishment. The Grand Rapids community was in shock, not only because someone had been unalived, but the unaliver was also a child. Still, the prosecution claimed that Jamarian's case should not be treated lightly, and that he had fully planned the unaliving. They pointed toward several key details. This was not the first time Jamarian had tried to unalive someone. Just days earlier, and per Jamarian's own confession, he had buried a kitchen knife in the playground, and tried to lure Connor and his brother to the site. He then also admitted that he picked Connor and that the attack was not completely random. The prosecution even pointed out that Jamarian was known to have anger issues and was disruptive at home. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Jamarian was a misunderstood preteen who came from a family that would regularly resort to punishment. Jamarian lived with his mother, Anita, and her boyfriend, Bernald. According to witness testimonies, Anita and Bernald were heavily addicted to substances. They also allegedly harmed Jamarian on more than one occasion. Bernald took the stand to testify that he did, in fact, hit Jamarian, and that he would receive the worst beating out of all of his siblings because he was the most defiant one. Still, the prosecution claimed that this was not a reason enough to unalive a random 9-year-old boy. They pushed for Jamarian to be tried as an adult and wanted the maximum possible punishment for the defendant. The case was controversial for several reasons. Jamarian was only 12, he came from a troubled background, and many members of Connor's family came together to plead for leniency. According to Connor's grandmother, there was no point in sending Jamarian away for the rest of his life. But that was what a court had originally decided for the 12-year-old. Under state law, however, Jamarian would only be sent to serve a life term if he did not meet his rehabilitation milestones while in juvenile detention. He would be incarcerated until the age of 21, required to have mandatory 6-month check-ins with the judge and show his reports. He was also expected to be a model citizen if he wanted to one day restart his life. In 2022, Jamarian had met all of his milestones. He had earned his GED and was on his way to earning a college degree. He was a model prisoner and had even started a support group. Most importantly, Jamarian never made an excuse for what he did. The judge reviewed all the information from the case and agreed that Jamarian had been sufficiently rehabilitated. In 2022, at 19 years old, Jamarian was released from prison.